So thank you for the introduction, Patrick. I'm going to talk today on how we're going to safely return to contact sport and what we as practitioners can do to enhance our return to play process. And I'm going to focus on two particular situations, COVID-19 and the normal pre-season. And we at SWA are quite excited in what we're going to be able to cover today, because it's going to be completely new and novel and unique in terms of what we present in terms of contact data and how we analyze it and use it to enhance our return to play process. Now, we at SWA work with several sports, but the examples I'm going to use specifically today are going to be with rugby union, but practical takeaways I present will be really applicable to other contact sports and also non-contact sports, as the science and the principles utilized in terms of our load-ins have been taken from running and load monitoring research from sports such as cricket and football, and it's been adapted to contact. Before I get started, I'd like to thank STATSports for giving me the opportunity to present, and I'd also like to thank the audience for taking time out of your schedules to watch this webinar. I'm Dr. Chris Jones. I'm Head of Science and Performance for Sports and Wellbeing Analytics. Sports and Wellbeing Analytics is a company founded in 2016 with the goal of applying the latest science and technology to wellbeing and performance issues. This led to the creation and development of our Protect system, which is a live, intelligent mouthguard surveillance system which is used to objectively monitor contact. So what I'm going to cover is obviously safely returning to contact, with a particular focus on what we can do and the tools we use. In part one of this presentation, I'm going to discuss the things we need to consider and the underpinning science when we're returning our players from inactivity. In part two, I'm going to go through understanding the data, because it's going to be completely new. So we need to cover off how we look at, define, and what type of variables we report. And then lastly, in part three, we're going to be applying the science and the underpinning data to enhance our return to play process in best case situations and in worst case situations, and what we can do to make the most out of each one. So I believe, firstly, in terms of understanding, it's really important to define what we're covering. Therefore, when I'm talking about returning to play, it's regarding athletes returning from inactivity. Now, athletes can return from inactivity in a number of ways, such as from injury, be it short or long term, from their holiday or off season to pre-season, and then in a rather unique situation such as COVID-19, where athletes and players have had enforced inactivity from competition training, which would have been the longest period of time they would have had off, and are required to come back in a very short period of time. What I'm going to focus on today and get into detail on is the latter two of those situations. But before I move on, I need to cover off, in terms of inactivity, there's a positive benefit of it. It enables athletes to recover and regenerate, but there's also an associated negative with it, be it detraining. And the longer we have off, the greater detraining effect we have, and that causes a decrease in our physical and our technical abilities. Therefore, when we're grading our athletes back in an appropriate manner, we need to consider how long they've had off and what situation they're coming back into. Is it in a controlled or an uncontrolled? Because we know that our athletes are going to be at an increased risk of injury or re-injury if we put them straight back into normal training and competition. This is why I feel the use of monitoring technology is essential to firstly ensure we know where we need to get our players to, and then secondly to know that the athletes are achieving what our prescribed plans are week to week, and they're not underloading or overloading. When we're progressing our athletes back, we need to consider a number of factors. Now, I'm not going to teach you guys how to suck eggs, but there's a large body of evidence and literature in the training load sector in terms of its relationship with injury. And on the left here, I present a review I did a number of years ago on training load and injury, and a number of three phases we need to consider as practitioners when we're loading our athletes back in. Those three are periods of training load intensification, changes in acute training load and accumulated training load. And we've got examples within the diagram. So the right-hand side is probably a common review and an article used. And that's looking at loading schemes and what we can do in terms of our upper and lower limits and grading these athletes back to reduce the risk of injury. Now, I wanted to present this just to show that when I'm talking about our periodized plan and our loading schemes later on, this is where the underpinning science has come from and where we've adapted it and used it for contact. So these are the factors we need to consider and the associated loading schemes. But I want to show, before I move on, two examples where we haven't been able to potentially factor in or account for all these considerations and variations. The first example is the NFL lockout in 2011, which is specifically looking at a decrease in physical prep time. They've had their preseason cut from 14 weeks to 17 days. And as a result, there was a reported fourfold increase in Achilles ruptures upon recommencement of training. And in terms of the first month back, the injury rate was more than double what we've seen in previous seasons. My second example I want to go through is the Bundesliga return following COVID. Now, they were able to have a normal time frame in terms of their preparation, but there was a number of variations that were different, which resulted in their spikes in injury rates being 2 to 4 times higher than what they'd normally see pre-lockdown. And those variations were they'd had a longer period of time off, which would suggest that you would need a greater preparation time. They've gone straight into their league competition, so they haven't had preseason friendlies, which are typically at a lower volume and intensity, so they're not graded back into their league season as well as they would have been in a normal preseason structure. And then also we have condensed fixture scheduling to be able to finish these games off. Now, there's been an introduction in with increased break time and substitutions, but this has still resulted in those injury spikes. And though the injury numbers haven't been reported for Premier League football, it's been indicated it's going to go in a similar direction. And if we consider rugby, the athletes haven't played for coming up to 159 days, with now only being allowed to train in small groups and limited time to train as a squad on their return to competition in mid-August. Now, when we look at contact, we have an additional complexity to train for. So when we look at rugby union as an example of this, there's 2 physical demands, the running and the contact. And if we look at running as an example, it's objectively measured via GPS technology. There's a large variety of variables in terms of its reporting of drills and training, and there's established terminology. In contrast, if we look at contact, it's been very highly subjective in its measurement. There's limited variables reported. There's only 1 or 2 in the literature, and no terminology exists. Now, this was really surprising, and which we found SWA, these cases, especially because contact's link and its relationship with performance, with injury, recovery and training, and it was still being used really subjectively in professional sport. Therefore, one of the issues we wanted to overcome and help you practitioners was to develop a means of objectively monitoring contact, because we believe it's essential and an important component to sport. If we have a look at the measurement of contact, traditionally it's been done predominantly by video analysis and only for competition. When we look at the variables produced, it's typically only been count, but the way it's measured it's highly subjective. So it assumes all contacts are the same, which we know we look at running as an example isn't the same case. And because of the perceived view of what contact is by an analyst, they can underreport the load by 25% when we've compared to our ProTech system in some cases. Now, that's a really important statement, because when we're trying to return our players appropriately, we need to know what the endpoint is and what the appropriate load is. And we don't want to be underloading them or under-preparing them for our competition. With the recent advancement in technology and the use of accelerometers, we can now start to objectify the contact demands in contact sport. However, to be able to do this, you need to consider a number of factors when using technology. the reliability and the validity of your sensor specification. So for example, do you have a high enough sampling frequency to be able to capture these highly explosive non-cyclical sporting actions? The location of your sensor, so how we're placing them, how they're fixed to the body. Are they going to reduce or increase the amount of noise in your signal and your variables in terms of what you're seeing? And then lastly, what we're measuring, what terminology we have or exists, and the variables we use to monitor the demands of our sports. Now, I want to dive a little bit deeper into the terminology. If we consider running on the left-hand side here, there's quite well recognized, defined terminology in terms of running intensity and type. So walking, running, jogging, high-speed running, and sprinting. And this aids massively in the understanding and helps optimize training, such as outlined in this figure, which was from a really insightful presentation looking at sprinting demands and training optimization in the first STATSports series webinar by Dr. Damien Young. If we look to the right-hand side, in contrast, the terminology doesn't exist for rugby. And what our system presents here is firstly linear acceleration over time and each impact, and we can see that all impacts firstly aren't equal as they vary considerably. But how do we break that down, and how do we make that usable for our practitioners? So this is what's quite exciting. We're using our ProTech system and the 20,000 video verified data set. We've been able to produce a robust thresholding to represent impact by different intensity thresholds, which we can therefore then dive a little bit in more detail into each section and help optimize our training plan. How we did this was and determined our threshold and level. I present as an example data set from professional rugby from this season from a club. What we can see is an impact frequency distribution with the frequency of impacts on the left-hand side. Each impact represented by a Z-score, and then our associated intensity type terminology. And we can gain and glean a number of really useful insights from this graph. Firstly, that the data isn't normally distributed, but it shows a generalized extreme distribution value, which I believe summarizes contact quite nicely. So how can an athlete in one instance perform a tackle and it be quite light, and then in the second instance there's different circumstances, he goes to perform the same tackle but can result in an extreme situation where they've been having to be injured or take off the field. Secondly, what we can see is that we've got two sections to this graph. To the right-hand side, which accounts for about 2.5% of the data, and the more severe terminology in terms of our impacts. Upon video verification, these impacts occurred from uncontrolled situations, such as foul play or under fatigue in the latter stages of a game, or just unexpected hits which resulted in a shoulder, a knee, a fist, an elbow occurring directly to the head. Now, if we look to the left-hand side, we can see that 97.5% of our data occurs between the light and strong intensity. And upon video verification, these were all controlled impacts from an athlete. And it's something we've deemed and termed trainable, and what we'd want to focus on. Because even though it's really important to monitor live the impacts, to know what's happening in terms of our intensity, but it's also really important to see the extreme events. But we wouldn't want to expose our athletes to those events in training. So going into and using the trainable events of our data, we've been able to now quantify the competition demands of rugby union for an average player. Now, traditionally, what had been reported in the literature would have been just 51 impacts. And this is, though it looks simple, is extremely insightful and applicable to you as practitioners, because we've been able to break down the competition by just the count and by each intensity type, and then the type of exercise, and going into a lot more detail. What we can see is something that also follows a similar trend to running data, where we see a high percentage of volume, 65% here, occurs in the light intensity, and as we progress an increase in the intensity, the volume decreases. And we can get a lot more detailed view of what the athlete's doing, and as coaches, then we can really streamline our training week. If we consider what may typically be done in a rugby environment, being high and low periodization, we can actually cover off quite a lot of our contact demand and our contact volume in our light and our recovery days, because we've been able to break down and identify that. And then during our high intensity days, we know what volume and the optimal level to expose our athletes during those times. Now, why this is really important is because contact accounts for the highest incidence of competition injury, and in rugby union that's 70%. Therefore, undertaking contact conditioning and making that specific to competition is essential for the athlete's health and performance, as it enables the athlete to be able to tolerate these external forces. Now, using this data in combination with the example training catalogue, this is when we can be a lot more detailed in terms of our pre-season and our preparation in grading these athletes back. What we can see here is the different types of events at different types of intensities, basically a regression and a progression. Now, this is an example, and it will differ depending on your coach and what drills and events you use in training. But it enables the practitioner to have the tools to now measure and monitor and optimize the training process. So if we consider our first situation in terms of grading our athlete back from a pre-season, we can use those two graphs in combination to give a really high detailed plan. Now what I present here is a rather simplistic view of a linear loading plan with a 1.3 loading scale. While staying within the constraints of the previous slide of having 65% of your volume in the low intensity scale, and then 35% of your volume in the moderate to strong intensity scale. Now, because we know the endpoint on this graph, we can now work back and load in an appropriate manner and a safe manner that isn't aggressive and would be associated with an increased risk of injury. Now, this is really applicable to a long-term injury, and obviously this is going to vary in terms of off weeks and different phases you're going to be using, but I think it's a nice simple representation of how you use data and the previous two slides to bring athletes back in a controlled situation. And unlike the other two presenters have said, we know what the end dates are and we can work back. But what happens when we don't have a controlled situation and we have time pressures to come back in a short space of time? And I think this slide here is really nice in visually representing what will likely happen versus what should happen. Now, on the left-hand side here, we're going to see that athlete's going to come back. There's going to be a spike in volume and intensity, and they're going to go straight into specific training. And on the right-hand side is what should happen is we should gradually increase volume and intensity and phase in specific training whilst decreasing our general training. But how do we achieve the latter and not the former, especially when in some cases we're not allowed to train in large groups and elicit an appropriate stimulus? Now, in order to negate the risk upon restart, the research and the use of training residuals, I feel, is really applicable to situations such as COVID-19. Now, the research identifies that if we're able to train at a reduced level during periods of inactivity, we can come back in a quicker time frame, safer, because we don't need to aggressively load our athletes. And what we can demonstrate here, on the left-hand side, we've got the weeks of ramping. On the bottom of the graph, we've got the percentage of residual volume the athlete would be training at during their inactivity. And then we've got, along the blue and yellow lines, the 2 weeks of inactivity or reduced activity, and then 4 weeks of reduced activity. Now, this red line is the upper limit of a 1.5 loading scale. So we wouldn't want to go above this just because of the research suggesting how much injuries increase once you do. What we can see here is there's two things that affect how long it takes to come back. The percentage at which we train at, and then how long we train at that percentage for. So in this example, we can see if we train at 40% for 2 weeks, it's going to take 2.5 weeks to come back, versus if we train at 40% for 4 weeks, it's going to take around 3.5 weeks of ramping to come back. Now, we've applied this research and then this literature to contact, to present contact training residuals. And what we present here is the contact competition demands by count and that represented as a percentage. And this would be a representation of what a team would need to do in terms of ramping and come back in to achieve their competition demands. Now, I've presented a number of loading strategies, but we've got an upper loading limit and a lower loading limit. And the lower loading limit shows that you need a higher residual going into week 1, but it's a less aggressive loading strategy, whereas a 1.5 or the upper limit loading strategy requires a much lower training residual, but it's a lot more aggressive in its increases week to week, and we're more likely to increase the risk of injury during that time. Now, during this enforced period of inactivity, engaging in technical and physical conditioning is possible. However, incorporating a contact stimulus is going to be quite problematic, especially when people are training at home or in small groups. So on my next slide, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail in terms of how we can actually elicit a contact training residual, so that when we do come back into team training, we can achieve levels of contact residuals at 1.3 and 1.1, rather than being down here, putting our athletes at risk. So on this graph, in terms of contact residual, there's two things which we've used. Because we've been able to quantify the training environment, the drills, and each event type in a competition, we're able to grade contact by intensity going up, and then start selecting appropriate drills to give a contact stimulus in 2 situations, at home and in small group. In addition, from quantifying the match demands, we know that 65% of the volume is going to account for light intensity contact exposure. So we know we can achieve a high level of residual load through low intensity means. And what we can see here is, at home, we could incorporate down ups and judo rolling and break falls in combination with running conditioning to help start eliciting. Then when we move into small groups, we could use grappling, technique work, pad work, and start increasing our intensity and our load. Now, the examples here from at home and in small groups aren't an ideal contact stimulus like we'd exhibit in a team situation, but it's making the best out of a worst case situation, and being able to monitor these impacts live, and being able to enhance this return to play process. So just covering off what we've gone through in this presentation is the underpinning science and what factors we've needed to consider during our return to play process, how we understand the contact data, and how we protect, define and report the wide variety of variables we have, and then combining the two to enhance our return to play process. What is really apparent though is having the tools and the means to be able to capture and monitor this data live. So the unique insights offered by a ProTech system really helps practitioners in guiding their athletes back safely. I would like to thank you for listening, and further information on this topic. We have produced a white paper which we found on the website on the following link. You can contact myself at chris.jones@swa.one, or contact us at swa.one/contact. I look forward to hearing from you and working with you. Thank you very much.
Cheers for that, Chris. Thanks a million. We have a question in. So I suppose you focused mainly on rugby, but I suppose some of the images and stuff on your presentation would suggest that you guys work with boxing as well. But like, how would, I suppose, some of the things, your return to play or your return to contact sport overall, how would this change for different sports? Is there other field sports or other sports overall, and maybe you might tell us a bit about them?
Thanks for that question, Patrick. So in terms of, say, the setup and the system, it wouldn't change much, and the variables we reproduce. Now, most of the things I presented here, the science and the underpinning principles, wouldn't be changed because it's highly applicable. What would change and what would be different for each of these sports would be, if you can recall, the impact distribution graph, and therefore the different threshold and levels would change for each sport and be made sport specific, so that when we're looking and using this data to enhance our training processes, it's relevant to those practitioners.
Okay. Well, thanks a million, Chris, for taking the time to put that together and to come on and share that with us. It is, I suppose, you know, we work with a lot of football teams, but rugby, I suppose, just has that added element of extreme contact, which you know, definitely needs to be addressed.